Hi, folks. Thanks for joining us. This is Ask Some Praxis, the 15th of June 2022 episode. And in this episode, we will be talking about something near and dear to everyone's heart, certainly those of us at Some Praxis anyway, and I'm sure some of you who have joined us, the intersection of collaboration and communication, managing your content lifecycle. So patterns that we've seen as we've worked with clients, things that we find consistent across many different organizations, things that modern SharePoint and Microsoft 365 enable well. This is our team, and we each come with a slightly different take on pretty much everything, including eating food in Copenhagen. We all approach those things differently. Two of us are out today, Derek and Mike. They will be joining us back the next time, I hope. But you're stuck with the four of us today, and we'll bring our various views on this topic to you live and in person. So we're talking about several things here. One of the things we want to touch on is the content management lifecycle. You know, where do you create content? Where do you move it to? What happens when it's done? You know, a lot of times people focus a lot on content creation, but they don't really think about, well, what happens to that content as it sits out there or evolves over time. We're gonna talk through that through the lens of the Microsoft 365 maturity model. We have a content management competency there, and some of the slides that we're going to show you are borrowed from that framework. We've got some common use cases we can run through, things that, again, we see repeatedly across clients and projects, and then some better practices or automation opportunities that we might see as we evolve. Anybody else want to jump in? I'm happy to keep going.
No, I think, I want to reiterate that is certainly as consultants, we are guilty of the thing that you said, where we spend a lot of time planning and talking about how things start, but rarely come back and see how things progress and move through the thing. And you and I have a talk that we always give people, and I'm sure it's going to show up in here, about, you know, where the content is created as opposed to where it's exposed and all that. But we never follow up with that. We paint this pretty picture and tell them how it's supposed to be done, and then we don't see how it works with the different customers. And so I think this will be an interesting one. Hopefully some folks in the chat room pitch in as to how these prescriptive things we're going to talk about, how it fits with their actual workflow and what they do.
Right. Exactly. And we do follow up. It depends on how long we're around. You know, sometimes the project ends and we leave, but, you know, one of the things we help people with is planning for that life cycle. What we don't always know is what happened.
Yeah.
It'd be nice to have a revisit every once in a while, which sometimes we do. So if you think about sort of the differences between different ways of different ways of collaborating, different ways of working with each other. This is a slide that Sue Hanley and I put together years ago. I think it was 2017. So, you know, it's been a while, so we've updated it. But you know, just taking something simple. You know, when we're working together, we may have different kinds of interactions. You know, very simple thing like a quick transitory thing like, you want to grab a sandwich. You know, we chat that in Teams. It has no relevance. 5 minutes later, it's a very quick thing. We have a portfolio of tools that we can use in order to interact or to collaborate based on the kind of collaboration that we're doing. Another example would be, you know, making a decision using groupthink. This is something where Microsoft Loop may come in handy. You know, what sandwich shop should we order from for the department from now on? That's something where we're making a decision. We probably want to slightly formalize that decision, but it's something that once we've decided, the process of getting to that decision may not matter a lot. We might use Loop, we might use Teams, we might use Yammer for something like that.
And I want to point out also to everybody that's not a Simpraxian, that Loop logo does not exist in the wild anywhere. We had to scour the internet using multiple search engines and hours of Photoshop skills to come up with that. So don't be ashamed if you take a minute to revel in that.
There's one thing on every slide that costs a lot of money, and that's it, right? It's actually a really hard logo to find.
Yeah. And so Julie mentions in the chat, don't use Bing. So when we were putting the slide together, we were all having a tough time finding this logo. I'm like, all I can do is find it in this video. And just by chance, I went into Google and searched for it and got like 14 results. So yes, don't use Bing was the lesson we all learned there.
All right, so sometimes we're working with somebody externally. We want to work on a sandwich with you. We're talking to a sandwich vendor, and we're inventing a new kind of sandwich together. Maybe we use email for that. We probably should have Teams there too, because we can use shared channels now. Though that's a relatively recent thing. So different set of tools for that, because we've got a different type of audience, and our interplay on the topic is going to be different. We might be seeking help. We might be crowdsourcing across the organization. There are 6 of us at Simpraxis, so if I want to know something about sandwiches, I just go, Julie knows the most about sandwiches. I'm going to go ask her what to do with this olive spread that I've got in the fridge. But we might turn to a tool like tap a nod to you, Julie. We might turn to something like Yammer to have that kind of a conversation. It's an across the organization sort of asking a question out loud amongst everyone kind of thing to reach a conclusion. We might have a very strategic kind of collaboration, something, don't tell anybody, but we're going to start a sandwiches division. We might keep that in email to keep it very close, but somebody could forward that by mistake. Maybe we use a private channel in Teams. So we have, again, different mix of tools that we might think about. Informational or inspirational. We see that sandwiches are trending up. We might use SharePoint News for that. We might make if we're a smaller organization, a channel where everyone is a member, where we do an announcement. We might use Yammer for that. The point of this is that sometimes you need to turn to. You can use the tools that are at hand, and sometimes you actually need to sit down in person, which is such an unusual thing. During the pandemic, we've certainly used Teams for stuff like this, but sometimes things like we're going to fire the sandwich guy mean that you should be sitting down in a room together. You should give the person the respect that they deserve and have that conversation in real life. So.
Yeah. I love this slide a lot. I'd never seen this slide until we started working on this Monday, and should we use a sandwich slide? The sandwich slide. I'd never seen the sandwich slide. I now love the sandwich slide. Particularly, I love the sandwich slide because I'm always getting questions from customers about how they should handle their inspirational sandwich material. And so now we have multiple platforms where people can share their inspirational sandwich news. Just have to figure out which modality of communication best fits your inspirational sandwich.
And if you're going to talk about inspirational sandwiches, I do have to say porchetta. Just happens.
It is really the most inspirational. We really need to make, in our demo tenant, we need to make a sandwich site for this very reason. That would be really epic.
Well, we'd manage our sandwiches a lot better, I think, if we
take our sandwich management up just another.
You would.
Mike, that working out loud thing is something that's a phrase that we talk to a lot of content owners about. When Emily and I in particular, when we're talking to them about what content should you have in front of people, how should you think about managing it? There's always this it's not ready thing, and that's one of the things we're gonna talk about is when do you work out loud and when do you not? When you're in Yammer, you're working out loud. When you're working in a team site, you tend not to be. All right. So through the lens of the maturity model, I would have sworn we had level 100 in here. I guess we lost it. Oftentimes at level, when we're talking about content management, so we have different portfolio of tools. We talked about that in the last slide. Here we're talking about less the tools and more what does the process look like? What happens when you're deciding on your sandwich menu? Oftentimes when you're at a relatively low level of maturity, this stuff is going on offline. In other words, you're sort of doing the work maybe on a piece of paper, maybe you're doing it in your OneDrive, and you might share that content in a team site when you're done. So it's sort of a very simple creation publication model. It makes sense in a lot of cases. Maybe there are a lot of things that we might build in our OneDrive where we don't necessarily share it with anyone because it's our own business personal stuff, right? Our shopping list that we're putting in the company's OneDrive, which is probably not the best place for it. And then sometimes we're, coming up with some ideas and then we're publishing them to a team site so that we can share them amongst the people we're working with on a particular subject. As we start, sorry, there are lots of builds on these slides that I forgot about. Let that, yeah. This is the joy of presenting from Teams. Okay, here we go. Next slide. Are you seeing slide 7? I hope.
Yes.
Level 300. Okay, awesome. So when we work together as a team, there's a lot of work that a lot of content that we're working on that really should never be seen by anyone. The first time you come up with a policy in HR, everyone shouldn't see that first draft. The first time that you come up with the plan for the company party, even, it's not necessarily something you want to share because you'll get into arguments with people about the schedule because you haven't really thought it through fully yet. So the idea is that within a team site, or teams, and you'll notice that there's a purple to teal gradient there because this can happen in SharePoint/Teams, depending on whether you're more of a SharePoint-centric organization or a team-centric organization. But you create the piece of content, you iterate on it, you review that content, and review could mean an approval process. It could mean that you've got to get digital signatures from 12 people. It could mean that the review is me saying to Julie, "Yep, it's done. Do you agree?" Julie says, "Yep," and we're finished. And then we publish it to a place where everyone can consume that content. That's usually not inside the team site. If it's something for an intranet, for example, we're going to work on that HR policy in the HR team site and then eventually publish it to the HR communication site that's part of the intranet. Everyone else is going to read from that location, not from the team site location. The copy that we've got in the team site location becomes the beginning of the next version. So we're well positioned for that next move.
And this is one area where we have the conversation a lot with our clients, especially when they're newer to Microsoft 365, where they want to approach it where you have one site and you start to expose some of that content as communication content from where it was created. But that introduces a couple of different issues. The first, just permission management. So if you have broken inheritance, especially on the document level, for someone who's newer to Microsoft 365, that can be really hard to see and to manage and to understand. And then from the consuming perspective, if you have access to a document in a library, but you only have access to that document, there's no context around it, and you aren't necessarily getting landing pages or an intuitive user interface to get to that content, you're not giving them that full experience of explaining what this information is. So typically we do recommend that that work in progress lives in the team site, and there's that additional step to publish out to the communication site for long-term consumption.
Exactly. And keep in mind that we're in the framework here of the Microsoft 365 maturity model. So we're thinking about, well, how does it get better from what we're looking at? How do we improve upon that? How do we improve on that? How do we improve on that? And if you think about where your organization sits against these slides, that's an interesting indicator for you to decide, well, maybe we should be at level 300 or level 400. That state where we're using one site for both the public and the private content, for lack of a better term, the communication versus collaboration content, is a very common state when you've been using SharePoint for a long, long time. You know, that's the way we built stuff in SharePoint 2010. We used to build these giant, call them giant pyramids of site collections, right? We might have a whole set of subsites that manages all of this stuff. And one of the things we do is we move people to SharePoint Online or to the Microsoft 365 platform is we tease those things apart. We come up with a team site versus a communication site to keep that permissions management at the doorway, as opposed to, well, you know, these 5 things in this folder are visible to everybody. I think, is that how we said it? You know, that confusion is the reason permissions get really complicated in that pyramidal structure is we're trying to jam too many use cases or user stories into one particular subsite.
I was just going to comment that the level of complexity that created with a security perspective was probably the harbinger of let's not do this anymore.
Right.
I think every time somebody asks me for item level permissions, I'm like, nope, won't do it. Can't do it. Just can't do it.
Yeah. And from the IT standpoint, it would demonstrably kill performance on-prem SharePoint if you would break permissions, you know, break inheritance. And then I also saw people trying to roll things up out of that and come up with custom web parts that rolled things up and all that. It got ugly. It got ugly bad.
Plus, you'd have people saying, well, I can see this and they can't see this. Why? And you couldn't answer the question, right? You'd be looking at the permissions. I've got one in mind right now that I looked at yesterday. The permissions list is this long. I mean, it's 40 or 50 different groups, each with different permissions. They make sense when you tease it apart, but nobody can just glance at it and understand. If your permissions are nice and clean, there's no debate. Yep, this is something everyone's allowed to see. This is not.
I think there's some edge cases that maybe got
absolutely
broke by that movement, but I think it was still in the best interest of the entire platform to take that part.
I remember when the first when modern SharePoint started doing the flat topology, I was really skeptical. I'm like, yeah, but this is such a great model. We've been doing this forever. You know, it was change. Change sucks. It's never good when change happens to you. But it really makes sense now, and I think that you know, almost all of us who are out here as practitioners are fully embraced it.
Yeah, I was never a fan of subsites, subwebs, whatever, but they were the devil I knew. And when Microsoft started saying, hey, we're going to go flat, I was with you. I'm like, oh, we can't do that. This is terrible. We can't do it because of, you know, we use subwebs because of search, and we use subwebs because of, you know, look and feel and all these things. And then they just started knocking all those things down. And so at some point, I'm like, I think I just don't like them because I don't like them. I think I just need to.
There is some irony to the fact that we now have hub sites, and that hub sites can have hub sites, nested hub sites. So
well, but
there's a little irony there.
That addresses one of the bad things about subsites is you couldn't move them around. You know, once you had it. So hub sites give us all of the functionality, but none of that rigidity. 100%. So yeah, I think it only took them 20 years, but yeah, they got it fixed.
All right, well, let's hop through a couple more of these maturity model levels quickly because we've got some other things to cover. But you know, if you think about it, if you've got the process, I'm going back a slide. So we've got a process where we're, you know, working on the content and publishing it. That's great, but wouldn't it be even better if we start gathering feedback? And you know, what we think of as active feedback as opposed to passive feedback. You know, it's great to have a feedback button, but you've got to do something with that feedback. Have those discussions. Make sure that as people are asking questions, you're improving the content. You know, you've got this paid time off policy. I don't understand the entire second paragraph. Well, you don't say next year we'll make it better. You actually say, oh, okay, we better improve that, and you keep it moving, right? So if you think about level 400 being different than 300, it's where you start to build in those feedback loops and you start to really be fine-tuning your content on a regular basis. The benefit of the web is that, you know, you can update things as they're needed as opposed to, you know, just thinking about things like yearly content cycles. You know, we do this with our code, right? Julie, you just launched. You just released version PNP.js version 3 dot something, and the next day realize there was a bug, so you do another minor release. You don't wait.
Yep.
You don't say,
No.
well, everyone's going to have to deal with that for the next 6 months. You fix it.
Right.
So just marching forward a little bit more, when we start to think with level 400 about layering in things like real life cycle management, thinking about, well, what happens when something's been out there for a year and we don't know if it's still right anymore. We think about compliance, we think about protection, usage and quality monitoring. So we're starting to think about using the extended capabilities of the platform to manage the life cycle of that content. And even better, we can think about using automation and machine learning and auto tagging, things that are showing up in product offerings like Viva Topics, where things are being automatically suggested by the platform to improve the content that you've got out there. So Emily and I are in the business of building information architectures for people on a daily basis. We're constantly talking to each other. How would you do this? Would you do that better? And then with Viva Topics and some of the machine learning that's coming along, the machines are starting to tell us, well, you might think about this. So we're actually having, in essence, a bit of a dialogue with the platform on how to better structure the content and bring another level of depth to it based on system suggestions.
Mike mentioned, yes. Mike Dixon said, do you not recommend starting at level 400? And I could start that an answer by saying, I think it depends on the maturity of the process that person is trying to implement. I don't think everything can be that needs to be managed can start at 400, but
well, I think realistically, you're starting where you're starting, right? Most organizations, I'm a very cynical person about this, and I do not apologize for it. Most organizations are sitting at level 100. They're dumping documents into a documents library. Maybe they're using folders, and that is not getting anything out of the platform. So that's the level 100 slide that was unfortunately missing. But you can't just say, well, we're going to start at level 400. You have to actually organizationally be there. The tools are not going to make that happen. So yes, it would be great to start at 400. I think in reality, many organizations start at 100 or 200, and they should be thinking about, well, how do we improve this? How do we improve our practices? But they have to commit to it. So as consultants, we're certainly going to go in and say you should be at level 300 or 400, and we're going to help you get there. But that doesn't mean that, practically speaking, that's going to happen.
Yeah, good point.
Mark, you raised good points, but the reality is that people may want to have a 400, but it's not applicable to everything. Right?
Sure, absolutely.
We may do that with our formalized content, but then we still have communication sites where we're pushing stuff out there, and people are just editing on the fly as they go, rather than ideating on it in a collaborative manner, and then bringing it up from the lower tools.
Exactly, the onus for my comment. Yeah.
And hopping back to the sandwich slide, we certainly wouldn't apply the same level of sophistication to every one of these kinds of collaboration, and the same thing is true of the content, right? It's just like, it doesn't make any sense. I've worked for a lot of organizations where they try to apply the same level of security to everything, no matter what. Doesn't make sense, right? A chat in Teams versus the financial summary of the company, they're not the same thing. You have to think about them differently, and that's why content types are so great. I haven't had my lunch yet either, Caleb. So some patterns that we see all the time, from personal to team collaboration. So we're building something ourselves, and then we share it with the team. That was one of the earlier slides. Collaborative authoring to intranet publishing. We could start developing a policy in a loop component. Would feel a little weird, copy and paste it out of there into a Word document, work on it together collaboratively there, turn it into a PDF and publish it to the intranet. So that cycle is often, you know, a change in modality, but also a change in sort of the net worth of that particular object. Sustaining, refreshing, reiterating. We've published that PDF. It's right as long as it's still right. And like I said earlier, you know, you want to think about not just regular review cycles, but what do you do when you realize, you know, paragraph 22 actually has the wrong date in it now? You have to make sure that you're able to continue the continuous improvement of that content. And then when it's no longer true, you know, that policy has expired and we're not continuing it anymore. What do you do with it? Do you just disappear it? Do you have to leave a placeholder there? How do you handle that? And there's some examples we run into all the time listed at the bottom. This slide deck is an example. Every single piece of content you work with in your life goes through some variation of this. Your grocery list, that note you left for your kid, you know, you say, what is it I want to tell him? I want him to clean up his room and I want him to, you know, make sure the bathroom's a little neater. We're having some guests over. Oh, scratch that out. They're not coming until next week. That's a content management life cycle. We just don't think about it that way. Someone else talk this through. All right, I'll do it. You're all looking at me like, no. So you know, Microsoft has talked about this for a long time, and they've had different metaphors for it. You know, there's the inner loop, the outer loop, which always looked to me like a picture of a toilet seat. Don't know why. Managing me content in OneDrive. So it's my stuff. It's business-oriented stuff. So we're talking about OneDrive for business here, not personal OneDrive. You're managing your stuff in the OneDrive. You manage we content, things that more than one person should have access to in the OneDrive and sharing it, or moving it to SharePoint and surfacing via Teams as appropriate. Something that is going to be worked on as a team probably should start in that open space. You know, that's the working out loud piece. Let's create that first draft in Microsoft Teams files or in that SharePoint site so that we're not moving it around over time. Though we can certainly take our first pass at it in OneDrive. Try out Microsoft Loop for the quick stuff. We've been playing around with it a little bit at some Praxis. We have a couple of use cases where we think it works pretty well. You know, you're coming up with an agenda for a meeting. You're writing an email to an important email to a client. Let's work on it really quickly and sort of brainstorm our way through it. Come up with ways to provision, automate provision and information architecture application of sites so that you get some consistency across the different sites in your tenant so that you can bring some order to the madness. Thinking about, you know, that content lifecycle, how do you use the tools on in the platform to retire content automatically? You can have retention policies that actually delete stuff or shuffle it off into a different location, et cetera, et cetera. One thing we've talked about already, we've been breaking a lot of permission inheritance. If you're saying one thing in a site has to have different permissions than the site as a whole, make sure that you're justifying that to yourself. Those exceptions may well indicate that you need a different container for that content instead. We have a site level permissions is going to be the easiest way to manage permissions across your enterprise if you can stick to it. That sort of working or private library in a site is something that we see a lot of, and that's the beginning of the snowball going down the hill. Audience targeting is different than that. That's trying to get content in front of people who are more likely to want it, which is different than permission management, which is really what we're doing. We must be ambivalent about some things, but I don't really care.
Yeah, we didn't care enough to fill that out.
Yeah.
When I think for me, the whole we don't advise, I think of that as a little differently. When I'm giving advice, I I try not to give advice so much as to give information for people to make their own decisions. And so I'm, for me, the ambivalence and the advise and we advise is all just kind of a sliding scale as to how strongly I feel that something is a good idea or not for a specific situation.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's no one size fits all answer to any of this. I think we often will say to our clients, there's some art to this as well as science. It's not, well, if it's Tuesday, it has to be blue. It just doesn't work that way. Sometimes it's, well, yesterday was Monday, but Tuesday's going a little slow, so we're probably going to go with pink. And that's just the way life is. Ideally, you're coming up with relatively predictable rules about when pink is going to show up, but sometimes you have to have a little bit of flexibility.
We should wrap up because it's 1:01.
Wrapping up, last slide. So a couple links there. Again, a lot of this was based on the maturity model. So if any of you haven't seen that, would definitely encourage you to go there. We'd love your thoughts if you have any input to what's going on there. There's a great article out there from Sue Hanley, team site versus communication site. Which one should I choose? And it talks about a lot of the concepts here. See us live coming up at a couple of conferences in Chicago, and we're going to have Collab Days New England in October here in the Boston area. And our next topic on June 29th will be content, nudging along reluctant content owners. One of the things that we often struggle with is how do we get content out of the hands of the people who own it to populate an intranet, start a new team site, etc. How do we mine those OneDrives, those hard drives, and get the content where it really needs to be? Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everybody.
And we will see you in a couple of weeks.
Bye, everybody.
Awesome. Bye.